Executive produced by Forrest Whitaker and directed by Keith McQuirter, the four-part docuseries By Whatever Means Necessary, The Times of Godfather of Harlem on EPIX.com is out right now. The series brings to light the dramatic true story of Harlem and its music during the 1960s and connects that history to our present moment. And with us right now is Keith McQuirter. Keith, welcome to the Brown and Black Podcast.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So the way this interview was pitched to me is like, hey, Jack, you have a show called Brown and Black, a podcast. And this series is a Brown and Black show, perfectly kind of meant for you guys, where we take a further, deeper exploration of the times of New Yorkers that were Latino and Black in Harlem and the music that came together, that shared music, that shared lifestyle that gave way to so much of the great music we have today. I mean, these were some of the precursors to disco. I mean, we were looking at the fusion, not only of music, but the fusion of cultures, this fusion of lifestyles and intellect. And to me, I think the 60s in Harlem was a form of a renaissance. Would you agree?
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. With the blending of culture, the migrations that were happening in the 60s and before the 60s, it all accumulated into this creative hub that a lot of the music we take for granted today, like hip hop, and the fusion of Caribbean music and R&B and all the good stuff that we take for granted today at the club and just listen to and dance to and bop our heads to. It has roots somewhere, and a lot of those roots started in the 1960s. So that decade gave us so much musically and politically.
One of the things that your series does is show just how connected the arts, music specifically, and activism are connected. But also, the blending, and that's the term used, the blending of the cultures. I want to know your thoughts, or in terms of your research, what were some of the things that were strongest that came across to what that blending actually yielded? Because it definitely yielded music, but, we had some common struggles there too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, my team and I, we took a deep dive into, this neighborhood, East Harlem, and the migrants coming out of the South who were fleeing racial terrorism, who were looking for better economic opportunities for themselves and their families, came to Harlem for work. And many of the migrants from Puerto Rico and the immigrants from Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean were coming for similar reasons. They're looking for work and provide better lives for their families. And so they ended up in Harlem. And they found themselves facing a lot of the same issues of discrimination, lack of opportunity. The Spanish-speaking immigrants, migrants, had even another set of barriers because they didn't have the language. And so they find themselves, in Upper Manhattan in that, I will say, isolation, if you will. They could only rely on themselves in a lot of ways. And the music that was coming out of the Latin neighborhoods, the Tito Puentes and the ballads that, a lot of the people we interviewed talked about their grandparents listening to the old, ballads from the Spanish language ballads. Eventually the Latin communities and the Black communities were all in the same nightclubs. They're doing the same things. They had the same oppression, the same fight against police brutality, these sorts of things. So to separate the two, many who we interviewed would say they couldn't necessarily separate the Puerto Ricans and the African Americans because they were facing the same issues. And so when Boogaloo came about in the 1960s, there was a real blend between the Latin beats and English language. Bang Bang came out. They blend the Spanish soul food and African American soul food, and it's right there in the language, and everyone could sing to it, everyone could have a good time to it. And so out of that blossomed a whole new culture. We interviewed Joe Bataan, and he was a Boogaloo superstar from that time. And he talks about, he made his first song. He was once on the streets. He was a gangster on the streets. He wanted to become a musician. And here's a man who really wills himself into whatever he wants. I mean, he just kind of like, I want to be a musician. And he became a famous musician. He didn't have any musical skills or any musical background, but he found a way to make it work. And so it was time for him to record his first song, which was Gypsy Woman, and he forgot his lyrics. And so he had to record. So the lyrics that he had in his head were Curtis Mayfield's lyrics to Gypsy Woman. And so he could just kind of borrow those lyrics and made them his own. And so and it became a hit, you know, and he talks about that in the series in a very colorful way.
I had interviewed Joe Baton for an NBC News series that we were doing on Latin music. And Joe and I really got to know, there was like a documentary on Boogaloo that came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Yep.
That was very good, but it didn't really include a lot of the African-American sensibilities of that. In this particular case, what was your vision here? Was it really to unite Black and Latinos and see how those musical inspirations based on the series Godfather of Harlem came to be? Is this a historical document? Is this a musical project? Is it like a Black project for Black African Americans that Latinos are included, or is it a Latino one with Blacks are included? Is it for both audiences equally?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. You know, when this project started to come to fruition, I really wanted to follow the story of what how music is used as a weapon for change, socially and culturally. And so that brought, specifically for music coming out of Harlem, or the POV of Harlem. The original premise was to really follow the message in the music, you know, and how that music was used to reflect the times, empower the people, or to give people hope to continue to fight forward, right? And so, you know, the series starts off in gospel. We look at gospel music and the spirituals that were coming out of the South that came up to the North with the migrants, and how gospel music was used to affirm ourselves, affirm our communities, you know, to keep our communities together, to keep that grouping, because that grouping itself was political, and as we later learned how to use in greater numbers across the country. Gospel music made it transformed into freedom songs, and those songs were used to continue the narrative of we're going to continue to fight forward, you know, using different philosophies. And Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence is well known. So many of the freedom singers would talk about freedom. And, you know, woke up this morning with my mind set on Jesus. I grew up in the Baptist church. My parents are both Southern, so I knew those songs very well. The freedom songs would, for instance, change it to, I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom, right? So it just sets the horizon, and it gets everyone on the same page. And that was one way that music was used as a weapon for change.
Well, one of the things about, you know, the more you learn about history, the more you kind of understand the present. I'm curious for you, part of the impetus obviously was as a companion piece to The Godfather of Harlem, but this really gives context to the world, what was happening at the time that these events were happening. For you in doing this, were there any things that really struck you about just how much either has not changed or just how we're really in a place where we were 50 years ago?
You know, it's upsetting how we find ourselves in the same place after all this time. You know, growing up and having learned about the civil rights movement through movies and books and my parents and aunts and uncles, you know, there's a real sense of like, that was the past, that was then. But as you get older, you realize, you know, when you start comparing, and not a lot's changed, right? We're still fighting the same issues, and even the parallels are very similar. In the late 60s, Nixon was elected president. And that was, in his election was a large part to the response of the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination. There were riots everywhere. There's uprisings across the country. People were terrified and people were fed up. They no longer just wanted to wait and hope for change. They wanted to make change themselves. So there's a whole law and order agenda, or I should say, just a lot of law and order talk, and a lot of his voting bloc wanted to return back to the America of the past, right? And so it's like, you know, that seems too familiar. You know, I feel like we're right back to where we were, and it's sad and it's upsetting. But it just goes to show. Listen, we can't sit on our hands and continue. Those of us of consciousness, those of us who want to see make better for our families and children, in the future, we can't sit on our hands. Like, we have inherited a legacy that you can choose to accept or not accept. And I personally choose to accept that legacy, that heritage. And so to learn about the music and how the artists and the musicians were using their skills at the time, and in conjunction with the activists of that time, from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X to the Black Panther Party to Young Lords, and so many people on that list and groups on that list, it's inspiring and just kind of opens my eyes up more. And I hope it does the same for the audiences, because here in 2020, you know, things are changing. There's been a climate change, cultural climate change. And it didn't start with the death of George Floyd, but it certainly had a global awakening of some sort with him. And so the musicians of today, and this is why it was so fascinating, and I was so excited to make this documentary, because the musicians of today are out there and making protest music in numbers we've never seen before. This is the renaissance of protest music, from unknown artists to known artists. And so whether they know it or not, because I don't know if all of them realize it, but you know, they picked up the baton and they're carrying on this tradition that so many artists were doing in the 1960s.
That's what I was going to ask you. I know the show is a lot about connecting the history of the 60s in Harlem, with Blacks and Latinos creating this new movement and revolution, culturally and politically and socially. But how do you see things today in the present moment with Latinos and Blacks, with Brown and Blacks? Is there still that same unity? I know we've seen fusions between reggaeton and some Black artists in hip hop in the last 2 or 3 years, but I don't feel that unity that we saw back in the 60s still exists in 2020. I might see that differently. You look like you're much more connected to that. Can you speak to that? What is the relationship between Blacks and Latinos today?
Yeah, I wonder the same thing. You know, with the Latino population in this country being so diverse, you know, it's hard to really to group all Latinos into one group and say, you know, these issues are important. And there's many different issues important to different groups in the Latino population. But you know, I wonder, because sometimes I do think we work in silos. Ultimately, we're all fighting for human rights, and I don't know if we're all always organized that way to help each other advance each other's agenda. So, this year, J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez performed at the Super Bowl, and under the direction of Jay-Z's, whatever his role is in that NFL thing. I'm not quite clear with that. It's still, but you know, J-Lo performed at the Super Bowl, and I was really inspired by her performance. J-Lo is one of our pop royalty in this country. She's put in a lot of work over the years, and she has gained, you know, the respect that she has earned. And she put on a performance that spoke directly to the backlash of immigrants coming from Latin countries, in her performance and the music choices that she chose. She spoke directly to power and the issues that were going on at the borders, with the families being separated. And that was a front and center mainstream, you know, protest performance by a major musician just this year that spoke directly to the issues and to power. I don't know if everyone recognized that. It's just J-Lo at the Super Bowl. Let's just, you know, drink beer, have fun, you know. She's fun on the pole, all that stuff. You know, she has all that razzle dazzle in there too. But you know, it's going back to what's the music and the message. What's the message in the music, right? And how's that pushing forward the culture? And she did it in her own way. So, you know, I would like to think that we're all on the same page, but I'm not quite sure. I mean, right now we're in a really interesting time. And I hope that we'll all get to a place where we can look at these issues as human rights and really, find a connection there. Because I think that's going to really be what's sustainable for us all.
I was just watching a video that you had tweeted out on Malcolm X on a show where I think he was speaking to about 3 white men in an interview. And he was talking exactly about what you just said, about that what's happening in the country isn't a racial issue. It's not an American issue. It's a human rights issue.
We feel that the problem, number one, of the black man in America is beyond America's ability to solve. It's a human problem, not an American problem or a Negro problem. We believe that our problem is one not a violation of civil rights, but a violation of human rights. Not only are we denied the right to be a citizen in the United States, we're denied the right to be a human being.
And so what you're saying kind of really sort of echoes a lot of what Malcolm X was really kind of looking at, that we need to fix the human problem of why whites look at blacks and Latinos in that way. And if we can fix that, then we could probably hope for a better future in America. But the way things are going, I'm not sure if that's going to happen.
Well, we also kind of have to look at who profits for us not to unify, if you know what I'm saying. You said something else about connecting and how connecting and the blend of cultures and the lack of it perhaps today. And it really struck me because I know Jamal Joseph, I know Billy Mitchell, and I know them from the arts. I know Jamal Joseph as a director, and I know
Academy nominated.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Billy Mitchell as an actor. We used to work together, and so. But seeing them now also as these historians, as these people who are storytellers, helping us understand our past, just shows me how connected art is to activism. They're all, these artists were all activists in their own way, like you said, J-Lo is. I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, just about the power of art, perhaps, and maybe the thing that will connect us is that art.
Well, that art is community, right? Like we make art as artists, we make art so that it can be shared and it can speak to a common sentiment, common emotion, common story, common narrative, or even break open and show us something new that we didn't quite see before, or we couldn't quite put to words or put to music. I was talking to, I can't remember who I was talking to, but we were talking about how accessible in the 1960s, how accessible, let's say, like Adam Clayton Powell was and Malcolm X were. These are 2 men who we know to be as giants today, who seem untouchable. Even if they were alive, they seem just way out there, right? But they were ordinary men in the community. They worked in the community. And, we have, one of our interviewees, Denise Oliver Velez. She was a young lord. She's always been very into activism before she was a young lord. And, she talked about how she would go over to John Coltrane's house. And he didn't know them well, her and her friends, the young people. But they were infatuated with John Coltrane, so he just let them hang out in his house. And he would practice. And so, isn't that crazy? Like,
right.
But these, if you think about it, these were people of the community, so it would be nothing to have, the kids in the block who look up to you say, okay, come on, hang out with me, it's all good. You know what I mean? Like, and so in that way, it's very communal. And in that way, it's a village, right? It's a tight knit community. Even the work of Nina Simone, she wanted to create her legacy to be of the people. She didn't choose the path of the super starlet. And she did the performance at Morehouse College. We have it on an archival. And it's Nina Simone, another giant, right? And there she is performing on the piano in front of bleachers. The kind of bleachers you had in high school where like the basketball bleachers, those brown ones, right? And it was like, wow, and she is fashionable, she looks amazing, and she's performing for the young people, young, gifted, and Black, because she wanted to give, she wanted to empower, the young generation, and she did. I mean, we have Nile Rodgers in the series, and you know, he talks about his family and how he was his brothers and sisters were more fair skinned than he was. He's the darkest in the family, and so when Nina Simone came out with Young, Gifted, and Black, he felt like he had a voice for the first time. He saw her on the cover of her album. She had natural hair, and there's this really cool artwork that's there, and he really felt lifted by hearing that song and seeing that art for the first time as a young person. So, you know, even if the artist is not there, and there's still that conversation that happens on so many different levels, from grassroots to the upper echelons. You know, you can't escape art. Art's everywhere.
Well, Keith, thank you very much for being on the show, and thank you for making this great documentary, which for me is, you know, one of those documentaries that I think every Latino and Black New Yorker and outside of that here in America should watch, because there's been this talk that Mike and I are constantly talking about on this podcast that...
Yeah, Keith, you made this for us, right?
Yeah.
I did. I had you guys in mind.
Right, you were like, all right, this is going to be perfect for Brown and Black. I'll be on there.
Absolutely.